Hi, welcome to What's the Point? I'm Bill Ellis, your host. Each week I talk with people about the moments that shaped them, the choices that changed them, and what those stories might spark in you. And with that said, let's get into today's conversation. Have you ever had the experience of suddenly realizing something that had been obvious all along? Something that was right in front of you, but you simply couldn't see it before? Why does that happen? And why is it often so difficult for us to change the way we see things, even when the evidence is right there? My guest today has spent much of her life thinking about that and studying that question. So welcome to What's the Point? I'm Bill Ellis, your host, and this is where we take time to explore what shapes us, what pulls us forward, and what we are really searching for underneath the choices we make. My guest today is Andi Simon. Andi is a corporate anthropologist, an author and the founder of Simon Associates Management Consultants. She trained as an anthropologist, but instead of studying distant cultures, she has spent many years looking closely at the cultures we live inside every day: companies, professions, and communities. She has written several books on these themes, including On the Brink and more recently, Rethink Retirement, both of which explore how the stories we tell ourselves shape the choices we make about work and life. Today, we're going to explore why people often struggle to change, why the stories we believe about our lives can be so powerful, and what happens when we begin to see things differently. Andi, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. Thank you. Excited to find out all of your life learning and experience and lessons, because change is something that can be absolutely the best thing in our lives. Oftentimes we fight it, and oftentimes we don't realize that change is exactly what we need. So let me start a little bit. You are a corporate anthropologist. So I'd like you to share with us what drew you to anthropology. But first, do me a favor and help me understand with a simple definition of what anthropology is.
It's a study of human society. Make it simple as can be. And what we've done for a long time is try to help people understand what is really happening, not what they simply think is happening. So anthropology emerged many, many years ago. I met Margaret Mead when I was at Columbia. She stood in the Museum of Natural History with her wonderful pole. I discovered that I really love to understand what makes people tick and how they do it. Now, there are 4 fields. There's linguistics, about the languages and how they have evolved. Remember, humans are meaning makers, and language is how we tell stories. And I love archaeology, and I read a great deal about it, about the distant past. And then there's cultural anthropology, where we're studying human societies. And it becomes really interesting as we look at all the symbolic parts of what we're doing. How do we make meaning? We're meaning makers, and we don't simply have this wonderful part. And then there's all the physical anthropology about our bodies and its evolution. But when you put it all together, we really want to understand humans, and we are an amazing species. Think about it. We've spread across the world without speciation. And that means that we can survive in many different environments, but we are all different and the same. It's really quite a fascinating field.
It is, and I'm looking forward to learning much more, and in particular, how you have channeled and kind of refined your focus within the broad field, as you just described, the very broad field of anthropology. At what moment did it occur to you, Andi, that anthropology is really about how humans make sense of their lives, more so, here in our lives, versus studying distant and ancient societies?
You know, I discovered anthropology by chance. I think so much of life is a series of doors open and you go through it not knowing what's on the other side. But I was an undergraduate, Penn State, and my father said, when you go off to college, be irresponsible. Go and discover things, which was perfectly fine for me. And so I was taking a variety of courses, and I fell upon this by chance. And the professor was profound. He said things like, remember, out of context, data doesn't exist. Humans are meaning makers. Somewhere around 40,000 years ago, we had a quantum leap in our brains, and things became not just a rock or a cross, but meaningful in some fashion. We began to impart upon it this thing we call culture, and I was hooked. Now, the interesting part is when I met my husband, I was a young woman, and we were sitting on a beach on Screw Lake, and he said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, well, I'm either going to be an anthropologist or an attorney. And he said, oh, be an anthropologist and I'll be. I laughed. And I said, well, we're married 58 years, so he's still here for me. But I was very interested in what we didn't know, how human societies grow and thrive. And being who I was, I realized it wasn't what I was going to do. It was actually who I was. And I realized that I liked to watch what people were doing, observe them, and then try to make sense out of it.
So that's exactly what you've done. When was it that you realized you were seeing something about human behavior that others around you weren't seeing, at least at that time? So you were kind of ahead of many people in seeing human behavior.
Well, doctorate, I had my tenure. I was a professor, and by chance, and I like chance, my husband was an executive at Citibank going through deregulation. And I met a bunch of Citibank executives at a cocktail party who said, why don't you come help us change? Now, I knew nothing about banking, other than my husband was now becoming a banker, and they knew nothing about anthropology, and thought there was some magic I could bring. They had all these people, I discovered quickly, who worked from 9 to 12 and 1 to 3. If they didn't steal, they had a job for life. And now they wanted to turn them into new flavors of people who could sell, who could service, who could have conversation with customers, who could reach out and build market spaces. And then I realized that they needed a perspective that wasn't simply tell these people what to do. Because by and large, telling them doesn't do much. You can tell people what to do. They make it up all by themselves. And so people would say, of course I can. And then you come back and watch a day or two later, and they were doing just what they had always been. And that's when I began to show people how the habits were so compelling. The stories in people's minds about what you think they heard when you said what you did, it had little to do with what their habits were going to be or how they were going to adapt. And so I slowly moved myself into a field that was going through change. Now, I had studied immigrants, and I was very interested in immigration, return migration, how people reinvented their culture when they came. And I had written on it. I had a postdoc grant on it. I was studying American society. I had done master lectures. I had done all kinds of things, but I had never done this. And I liked doing things I hadn't done before, but I also knew that they didn't know what was actually happening. And so I would take them inside their own organizations. And I say, sit here with me and watch. Now, watch what's going on now. Draw a picture of it, visualize it, and what would you like it to be? And until the people in a bank branch or in an organization could understand visually what it was you meant, they would make up a story of their own. And you'd have 17 different ways of doing what the words were, because nobody really understood how it fit into something which was a whole new way of thinking, a new mindset, a new story. So, your question was, I began to evolve from being an academic who studied things to a business person who had a perspective that was appropriate for the times. If things are fixed and people are happily doing whatever they're doing, they don't need me. I just create disruption. I used to say to my clients, when I got into business, if you want to change, have a crisis or create one, or I'll help you create one. Because until there's a crisis, you won't do it. So I spent 14 years, I was SVP of one bank. I bought their first computer, date myself. And I watched the secretary wonder what to do with my whiteout. And we had deep conversations about what to do with the whiteout. It was most interesting. And I realized that new wasn't necessarily better for people who were perfectly comfortable, happy doing what they had done. And so Bill, as you're thinking about the world that we're in today, it is a fast-changing time that humans will say, of course, AI is important. Of course, blockchain is important, and they'll ignore it every time they can because it disrupts the story in their mind. Now, to finish my little story, I spent 14 years in banking as an executive in 3 banks, helping them change. And then I went into healthcare during managed care. And the reason I wanted to finish the story is that I was always the anthropologist, but the venue was different. And I had doctors screaming at me. I can get patients. I can treat patients. I just don't know how to get them. And it was an interesting time of helping very smart people, and doctors don't change very easily, adopt a whole new way of getting patients. So, and then after 9/11, I went into my own business, and that's sort of been the third part of my journey. And I've enjoyed every part of it.
Outstanding. So that's Simon Management Consultants. And One thing that hearing from you is at one point you realized that the biggest barrier to change was the story people were telling themselves. We tend to be kind of wrapped up in our story, which prevents us from seeing something new. How did that become apparent to you? Did it happen quickly? Did it happen over time? And then I guess that leads to the question of once you realize that, that opened up why you're doing what you're doing and how do you do that?
A wonderful question. When I went and I began to study, to do the research, I think experiential learning is the best learning because I can tell you things, but until you actually go experience it, you're really not sure what the words mean. So
Mhm.
I went and I did field work actually in Astoria, Queens to study Greek immigrants. And then I went back to Greece and I took my daughters when they were 4 and 5 to study Greek women. And I got deep into understanding the complexity, what was going on for them in their lives, how they had to make sense out of it. But I also began to study the cognitive sciences, the neurosciences, because we're full bodies. We decide with the eyes and the heart. We think it's with the head, but the head makes sense out of it. And then I began to really get into the fact that we live the story in our mind. Once we've crafted it, we own it. I often say to people, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And we project onto it. We're always the hero. And whatever story we have, we are the right. So now a whole lot of stuff comes at us and we deny it, we delete it. The amygdala protects us. The oldest reptilian part of the brain deletes it for us. It puts a lot of cortisol in our brain and says, go away. And so I thought the pandemic was one of those crises that showed us how adaptable humans can be in a crisis. It's bigger than most companies ever deal with, but it's not that different from a company who loses its largest client. And I've worked with clients over the years who got stuck or stalled, colleges that aren't growing, manufacturers who have a new product no one's buying. Interesting stories about companies that thought they had a new solution that nobody seemed to agree with. They thought it was a great idea, but they weren't absorbing it. So my first book, On the Brink, came about because I wanted to show people how a little anthropology could help their business grow.
Mhm.
And I take my clients out with me to go see things. I learned early that if I saw it and I told them what I saw, they would delete me. But if they saw it, then they realized that what they saw and I saw often were two different things, even if we were sitting in the same meeting, listening to
Mhm.
the same conversation, or in the same manufacturing plant. So our stories were influencing our observations. And it was so much easier to delete it than to begin to change it. And so I began really to understand how to help people visualize what it is they wanted, but most of all, to go see it and hear it through the eyes of those customers that they thought were really
Mhm.
not understanding what it was we were making. So it's been an interesting journey for me and for them.
So it sounds very interesting, and I love the fact that you take people out and observe as opposed to just speaking to them or book learning or however you want to phrase it, actual experience. But we don't change based on everything I've read from your work because we get new information. We change because we start to see things differently. But then you also said our brain can tell us, can discount some of the new things we see. How do you work through that? And you've talked a bit, Andy, in context of corporations or businesses or organizations as a whole. How does that filter through the individual people that make up that company? How does how do you take one person who starts to see something differently and then have that spread throughout the entire company?
Great point. So a couple of things we should realize that people are copycats. And so I'll give you a case. I had a client and he had a company that was well organized and had been having declining sales. So he bought 5 other companies and he was very frustrated because he fired all the CEOs, he retired them. And then he found that the companies he acquired weren't growing the way he thought and putting in new processes weren't being embraced or being understood. So I said to him, you have a story in your mind about how things should get done. And each of these 5 companies, when we did our cultural assessment, were very much family firms. They waited to be, told. They were collaborators. They weren't system-oriented. The rules didn't rule. We have very different ways of thinking about things. So when you start to put copycats together, you put a team of up to 10 people into a group, and you have them begin to work together to change the way we do things here. And you need to have the data to demonstrate that the changes are going to deliver better results. You need to have a reason, but by and large, you need to help each other see what could be done, because I'm not going to change and risk myself or my job if nobody else around me is changing. And if I change, they won't be in sync with me, so I'm not going to do that. And it's easier to say no than it is to say how. But if we put circles together of teams, then all of a sudden it becomes a leadership group who's beginning to demonstrate the transformation. For him, it was really a transformative moment because you can't dictate, and people are different. And they heard you, but they didn't know what it meant, and they certainly weren't going to risk themselves and what they'd already done for so long for a different manager that worked. So now, why should I do it? Other than you're going to tell me it's going to get me better results, but I'm not sure even how to do it that way. But you put a team together, and next thing you know, a new model emerges, and a new belonging to a group emerges, and we begin to help each other. So I've been working with a healthcare system in Eastern Appalachia, in Eastern Kentucky, for 8 years now, and I educate their emerging leaders. Perfectly good illustration. And they give me 12 folks at the beginning of the year. And we spend a year every month working through developing their leadership skills. Now, these are good managers. And they say, how am I going to be a better leader? I said, well, managers do X. What do leaders do? And leaders need followers. Managers don't have followers. Managers have subordinates. The whole different story. And so we begin to change the story in their mind about who they are and what it is they're trying to achieve and how they're going to get it done. And they bring back illustrative stories each time of small wins. So in the first group I told you about, we created circles. In this one, we create stories. And each one coming with a small win helps the others begin to see how they can also, they learn from each other. And the copycat factor rises to the surface, and all of a sudden we're all beginning to change what we're doing and how we're doing. And I'm finding it, I keep hanging around after 8 years, and they keep saying, no, we need more, because they all then become elevated to the next position in their organization. They become the C of this and the COO of that, because they now change this story.
Thank you. That leads me to follow back to a question I had a moment ago, and that is, in my experience, not as an anthropologist, but just as someone who's lived his life, my understanding is that our brain and our behavior, and at the core of human, we seek efficiencies. Change takes more effort than not change. So once you get started, even if it's in groups, circles, whatever title the company chooses to give them, how does that momentum continue? How does that momentum continue to build? And what safeguards, if any, or what tactics, if any, are in place? Because, sorry for being so long-winded in the question, but my mind says, and my experience says, people will start to slide back into their habits and into the stories that have gotten them wherever they are in their life. How does that momentum grow and continue?
You're describing the effective leader today. Because to your point, your mind, when it starts to learn something new, even a new way of driving to the office, it has to work so hard to pay attention to that GPS that it hurts, literally. There's not even a fiction to it. So now the question is, I want them to begin to change the way in which they use AI in developing. I was reading about a journalist who's producing for Fortune new articles using AI faster than all of his colleagues are. Now, he discovered how fast it could be without anybody saying do or don't. He experienced it. He did it. But if you're in an organization where people are resisting, they're really not resisting the change as much as what they're going to lose. And the loss is very disturbing to them because they know what they know, but now you're teaching me things I'm going to feel incompetent. Fine. I'm going to learn golf. And I never swung a golf club, but you want to play on this great course. And I feel so consciously incompetent, I'm going to never succeed. Well, if the times are changing and you need to adapt, then I need to have two things that are important. One, positive feedback, some data that shows that what I just did worked better the first time. I hit the ball and I hit it again. I didn't hit it the third time, but I'm hitting it, so I get that positive feedback. And then somebody to say, you're moving in the right direction. Let's address it. So one of the things we put into place are meetings every week to discuss small wins or positives. I love building on positives because, to your point, the brain's going to hate me. We like to be efficient. The brain uses 25% of your body's energy. It doesn't want to work more. So somehow I've got to break through that with the positivity that comes with a attaboy or attagirl or keep going or let's build on that. And if you can begin to build upon it, then the next week you'll have two small wins and you'll begin to see it matters. Now, my last point to your question is people want to matter. I think one of the things we don't realize is that matters more than most everything else. Sure, they work to make a living, but if they don't matter in that job, it is no feeling of positivity at all, no reason to come to work in the morning. So how do you make the changes matter? So it's not a loss, but it's a gain. And this is all about managing the minds of the folks who you're working with or for, and it turns you into a good enabler, a good positive. It's not, if you think about the pandemic, it wasn't that hard to change. We had to. It wasn't fun necessarily, but we did it. You can keep changing now with the new technology that's coming and the new people moving up. Just be open and praise the good, correct what's not, and keep moving forward. I hope that helps you and your listeners.
I hope so too. It's helped me. The intellect of my listeners, I guarantee that it has helped them as well. Really profound information, which is one of the reasons I'm so grateful that you've gifted us your time and sharing your experience. One of the things that you've written about a lot, talk about a lot, teach a lot is myths. And that there are myths in organizations, there are myths in business, any kind of organization, but there's also myths within ourselves and within us as humans. How do you identify or help clients identify myths? And how do we go about addressing myths? Because to me, I take myth as something that is believed but not proven. And so I go about identifying myths and then addressing them, point that we either validate them or we point out that's not the most efficient way for you to be thinking.
You have asked the wonderful question of how do you validate something you believe to be true? Humans create this reality. Think about how many different cultures there are across the globe. Each one believes it to be the way we should do things. It becomes our truth. What we've learned is that the only truth is there's no truth. And what we create is a mythical reality that we believe this illusion to be true. You said it so well. But once you hold it and you live with it, it makes doing it outside of that very challenging. So my second book called Smashing the Myths of Women in Business was about women who were told they couldn't be a CEO, they couldn't be in aerospace, they couldn't be a geologist, and they were given all the reasons why they couldn't. There was nothing factual about it. There was nothing actually limiting in their abilities to do it. It had become the reality that was a myth about what women could or couldn't do. And each of the women in that book, and I interviewed many, many more, said, of course we can. And became extremely successful at doing things that people said they couldn't. Now, part of the power of the myth is control. And it is so much easier to control people with a reality that is made up, not validated necessarily, but we all believe this to be true. And therefore, we're going to live according to the rules of this myth. And it becomes a social ordering tool that we live with. Whether it's real or not, we are outliers. Our people don't like outliers because they make belonging so difficult. And people would rather belong than be an outlier. But in fact, if you're going to change, you become the outlier and you begin to pull others with you. And next thing you know, a new mythology is emerging about what can really be, not really what was before. So it's a very powerful tool that humans use. And everybody walks around with a myth about themselves. And it's the story that becomes mythical and heroic. And we're just wonderfully meaning makers. We create things to help us survive. Yeah. And I love it. But smashing them is more fun than just simply saying, well, women can't, so don't. And here's what happens.
Well, it sounds to me that what I'm hearing you say, Andy, is that being able to show real world examples helps to bust myths. Because part of the problem with myths is people say things so often that eventually it becomes easier just to believe it, and that becomes a challenge. But I'm gonna turn the figurative camera on you. What was a myth that you discovered about yourself? What's something that Andy suddenly had an epiphany and either that you were believing you were that hero or something along those lines? Share with us the Andy story about myth busting, or
You
one of
know,
what I assume are many stories.
let me reframe that into the imposter syndrome mythology, because
Okay.
I work really well with women, particularly women who struggle with, am I competent and confident about what I'm doing? And so I never struggled with the confidence part or the competence part about my ability to do things. But then as I moved along, I began to realize that the myth that I could do whatever I wanted to was constricted by others around me. And I needed to either educate them to what I was capable of or ignore them and find other routes to go. And so I was an academic and I got my doctorate and I got my tenure and I was following a path. And the idea of me moving into business, people said, "You're going to do what?" Well, I have no idea how I'm going to do this, but I don't know anything about banking, but I'll figure that out. They don't know anything about anthropology. But the myth was that anthropologists couldn't do that.
Yeah.
What's an anthropologist doing in a bank? We're going to help them change. How are you going to do that? And so all of the mythology around what my academic credentials were was believed by others. And as I broke through that to redefine what I was capable of, I had to break down a lot of myths about, what is it? You asked me the first question, what does an anthropology do? And without any wisdom about it, I could just simply say, I'm a consultant, but I brought a particular perspective to it. And I must tell you that when I launched my own business, my PR firm said, "You're a corporate anthropologist that helps companies change." I created a new myth because there were no corporate anthropologists that I knew at the time. He didn't know what a corporate anthropologist was. And I said, "Of course, that's what I do." And people say, like you said, they said, "I thought you studied small scale societies." I said, "What makes you think a business isn't a small scale society?" Ah.
Hmm.
And so I'm writing a new mythology, a new story, a new reality that really wasn't particularly well understood then. And I must tell you that we still struggle. I don't struggle. I've been successful for 24 years now, and people came to me and learned something because they needed to change. They didn't need an anthropologist necessarily. They really didn't care what I did, but they needed something I could help them with, which is to see the world through a fresh lens. And so I think your question is a really profound one because I think we live that myth every day. And I was asked the other day at a networking thing, well, how would you define your significance? I said, I just help people do things that they don't think they can do. I hang out. I help them see the world the way maybe it's really happening. So it's an interesting mythological question. I love it.
Well, good. Now that leads to another question that I think may, if it's not going to be the crux of this show, it's going to certainly be up there in terms of importance. What actually triggers real change for people?
When things are broken, they need to fix it. They tend to want to fix it backwards to what they know, but the past you can't recreate. You need to go
Help
forward.
me understand that, please. Sorry to interrupt, but I think that's an important statement for me and our listeners to understand before we move forward. They try to fix it working backwards.
Right. They know what they know, and they know what they did, and they're trying to put together what was. It's a little like asking people after the pandemic to come back to the office and try and recreate the culture that was there before everything was broken apart. But instead, why not think about how can we recreate it in a better way? And I think that is the crux of this. How to be curious about what is possible looking forward, as opposed to trying to look backwards and figure out how did I do that? Because the past is the past. And whatever the context was then, you did it then. But the future is a very different one. And I often think that the future is already here. It's just not widely distributed. But to your question, what will help them, Change is to begin to accept the fact, be curious, open, fragile, agile and fragile a bit, about their adaptability quotient. How adaptable am I to the new things that are coming? How curious am I? Go experiment. I often tell my clients, go to a trade show that you've never been to. Go to a robotics trade show. Go see how robotics are coming. Go to something that is out of your comfort area and begin to pull things in that are different ways of solving a problem that you haven't thought about before. So I think these are great times for people to not look back, but look forward and create new. And the young ones are doing it all the time. I mean, they're just redesigning most everything the way it's been. Won't be tomorrow.
I agree with you 100% in what you were saying. Now, the other thought that comes to mind for me is people aren't going to change that don't want to change. And I think that's a starting point that a lot of people have to understand, that change has to be self-generated and something that we seek. And the fear of change has to be accepted and dealt with. A lot of folks, in my experience, I like the way it used to be. Why do we change it? Let's go back to the way it was when I was really happy and things seemed okay. That's pretty widespread these days. But is there any way to initiate change in someone who has that fear of moving forward, or the attitude of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? And if it is broke, do we really need to fix it? Don't change my world. Is there anything I'm sure there is, but let me quit talking and let you give me the answer. How do we get people to open up to change that are so rigid and fighting against change?
You're leading into the work we're doing now on retirement and retirees. And I don't want to necessarily jump out of the corporate, but you're asking exactly the question that people who have made it to retirement are discovering when they leave the business that they've been in. Some of them are perfectly happy, but many of them now have to change who they are. I used to be my business card. Who am I now? My daily structure. I used to get up and go to the office. Your question is a perfect setup for talking about the transformation of people as they move from work to retirement. I don't have anything to do today. I get up, I go to the gym, I come back, have my coffee. I have nothing to do. What am I doing? The third thing is, what's my purpose? When I worked, even if I wasn't always happy with work, I had a purpose. I mattered. I mattered to other people. And then I had friends. How many people have left the business only to discover all their friends there don't talk to them? It's one of those things that I'm finding the most disturbing, because they don't have any friends outside of the office, at least not a lot. And now that they're outside of the office, the people inside don't talk to them. They don't respond to their calls. They see them as outsiders who have left them behind. So it's a wonderful time for people who have planned so hard. Their finances are perfect. They know they can live for another 20 years. And next thing you know, they have to change everything about their life. And they are, in some cases, ready to do it. One fellow who I love his story, he was going to get his golf score down from 14 to 4, his handicap, only to discover all his golf buddies were drinkers, and he was becoming an alcoholic. He said, I failed retirement. How do you go find a job? It becomes an interesting time to rethink or reinvent, to change the day that you had. Now, people don't think about it when they're in work, about their daily structure. It's a habit. You don't pay any attention to it. And then you leave, and now what? I say to people, take a year and do all the things that you've been waiting to do. You don't have to change everything. Begin to re-identify. You're now retired. What does that mean? Are you part of this tribe that becomes, a tribe? And then, go on the trips. Go spend time with family. Take up art. Work on your golf game. About a year into this, wait for oh my gosh, I am so depressed. I have no purpose. I have no idea what I'm doing. And now I've got to recreate life for myself. Now, the transitions have times happen when you've lost your job at 50, not at retirement. And some of those things make you want to change or have to change earlier on. And so there's a gentleman who's referred to me who's going through a transition just like that. Very successful. And now he's out of the job. And the transitions are the catalytic moments that make you pause and rethink, who am I? How do I organize my day? What's my purpose? Who are my friends in my community? And those are essential. They're not sort of outside of me. They are who I am. And so, to your question about how do we get people to change? Well, if you're happy, keep going, as long as the world around you isn't. But I guarantee you there's going to be some transformation coming. You're unexpected for. I didn't expect to get fired. Or you're I'm planning my retirement. And next thing you know, ooh, what do I do now? And so it's both not easy, but necessary. And you need some buddies. I think the biggest thing is too many people are alone and lonely. And the depression comes from the loneliness. No one to talk to about it.
Well, there are so many studies that show that when it comes to longevity, one of the keys to longevity is community. Having a community. It doesn't mean you have to have 100 people. It can be one or two or three close people, but community. And what you're talking about, Andy, is actually in the exact keeping of why I do this show. That's the entire reason What's the Point exists. Because from my own experience and people I know and learn and study, if we don't know our purpose, it doesn't matter what we do. And you mentioned earlier, let's go back to something you said because it really struck me. Who am I? Well, I was this business card.
Yes.
And that strikes me as how certainly in America, but globally, the question that is most often asked when you meet someone new is, what do you do? Not who are you? What do you care about? What's in your soul? What's your purpose? And that's why I started What's the Point? I was one of those people that had the opportunity to start a new career without my choice necessarily when I was 50. And I started to think, what was I doing? Why was I doing it? What should I do now? And what's the point? The biggest thing I would say, based on what your conversation is and your insights, Andy, and thank you for them, but also based on so many guests that I've spoken to recently, David Sherman and Annie Dyke, who basically say, don't wait to do what excites you. I mean, Annie put it perfectly when she was asked, what's the point? She said, remember that you're dying.
Yeah.
You don't know when, but don't put it off. And David Sherman, with his family and his young children, said, we want to travel. We want to have experience. So they moved to Spain for a year, and it turned out to be 2 years because he chose not to put it off. And I think that's very important. So why do we resist the insights that help us grow?
Well, if we go back to the beginning, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. And once you're comfortable with that story, the myth, the illusion of the reality, unless there's a trigger of some kind, you don't lose weight, you don't start to exercise, you don't really find new friends, you're lazy. You said we're efficient, we are. We do what we always do, the habits take over. Your day becomes yesterday, and you're not thinking about what really matters until something upsets it. And so, and I don't think we're intentionally resisting it. I do think we are efficient and lazy. I often said to people, customers aren't loyal, they're lazy. They come to you because they've always come to you. You think they're loyal, but they're really not intentionally coming to you because of loyalty. They just do. You reduce the unexpected and the risk of making a bad choice, and they know what you're good at and what you're not. So they use you intelligently or intentionally. So it becomes really quite interesting. But my husband and I have gone to 40 countries. When my daughters finished college, to your point, I said to him, listen, I'm not waiting to retire. I'm an explorer. You're an explorer. He's president of his company. I'm president of mine. Let's go explore. Every 90 days we went somewhere. Right?
Nice.
And now, I said, the world's a bit nutty. Where shall we explore now? And then the other part is family and friends become even more important as we grow older because the time with them is less. So once you become really aware of it, you find ways of making them much more meaningful and purposeful. And I find myself insisting that we reach out and we talk to friends and we send them notes. We do things to remain meaningful and purposeful and happy with them, that they matter. And sometimes you realize that you're helping them know they matter as much as you matter. Say gifting time and caring.
Yeah. It's amazing how much we realize that we matter when we help others realize that they matter. It's just one of those oddities. You talked about customers aren't loyal, we're lazy. And I'm going to say we. And one thing that struck me, Andy, is we're lazy to the point that I don't always do business with someone because they've worked well for me with their service or their product. But I'll call Andy and say, "What worked for you?" And you'll say, "Well, I've always worked with Sally." And I'll go, "Oh, Sally, I'm Bill. Can you help me?" And that's the research that a lot of us do. It's
Yes.
recommendations from fellow humans, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it just underscores to me the point that you made that people are more under the heading of lazy than loyal.
Well, and I do think, though, that we try to evaluate the ecosystem in which we're living and doing business based upon, remember, belonging matters. So you did that based upon so-and-so, you are like them. And therefore, if they like Sally, I'll like Sally. And that's really, you're not
Mhm,
going to go out to somebody so far out of that comfort area that they don't fit into your story about how you chose Sally. But I
mhm,
do think that the times they are changing. And therefore, you're not going to find too many who are going to be the experts in XYZ that you can turn to. And so you're going to watch videos, you're going to read, you're going to
mhm.
listen to Substack. I love my Substack audience. And I just think we're turning to new ways to engage with people. And it's no longer tactical and practical, it's emotional and meaningful. Make sense?
Mm. Yes, it does, 100%. And it's my hope that myself and others do take the time to try to validate the resources and quote unquote experts that are available to us through internet and social media and everything else. Because again, it's pretty basic human tendency, I think, to say, "Oh, well, I heard this and it kind of works for me, so I'll just accept that," as opposed to really doing the work to understand that. What do you think people misunderstand most about how change actually happens?
You know, they think it's unique, that somebody had a problem they solved and it was unique, as opposed to it was systemic or it was a part of a redesign that you can do as well. And I do think that we learn from each other. We're monkeys. We like to watch each other. And so if you see somebody has done something, don't assume that they did it and nobody else could do it. Borrow from them, learn from them.
Mm,
I think if you just simply say, how did you do that? How did you change? How did you lose all that weight? How did you change the way your business was growing so that it's much more efficient now? How did you apply AI so that you are really getting more return on that investment?
mhm,
What are you doing with it? And do the right things with the new things that are here. But don't assume that they can change and you can't. And begin to push yourself to see. And I think curiosity is probably the least understood and less tapped into possibilities now. Be curious.
mhm,
Don't assume you know anything. Keep asking why. Ask questions. How did you do that? Really, how did you do that? Not the surface one.
mhm.
Really give me the ins and outs and pick the brains of people who you would like to mimic in some fashion or at least understand better. You do a podcast to learn more. I do my podcast for the same reason. Every time I share somebody's story, I learn more. And I do it
Mhm.
for selfish reasons. I grow and my audience does. And it is not uncomfortable for me to say, I'm doing this so that I can share this great story with somebody else and let you learn from them and help them grow their business.
Well, you're 100% correct in my what's the point and why do I do this show? I do this show so that I can help a lot of people get that aha moment. And the first person on that list that I want to get aha moments is myself.
Yes. But I don't want to preach without somebody to tell the story for me. You're great.
Well, just a few more questions, or we're coming up to the time you committed to. What, if anything, well, there is something, and you'll tell us what it is. What do you find yourself paying more attention to now than you did earlier in life?
That everything ends and opens up a door to the next phase. I never paid much attention when I was younger. I was on a road, on my way, you know? The car was driving, I was driving it, and I could make detours if I wanted to. But I am finding that things that are coming to a close, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. I was a speaker widely and finding that the requests are diminishing. I'm still speaking. I have a dozen speeches this year, but Not as many as there used to be. Clients, my web traffic is down a little bit, diminishing. I can see it going down, but things are ending. But that's okay because I'm opening up new doors. And so I'm paying attention to the new doors as opposed to worrying about what happened. And because times changed and the buyers changed and the interests in what I do change. I'm a blue ocean strategist and I used to get lots of inquiries about it. Less so now. It's okay. It's 20 years. And I there's a curve and I've run through it and it's perfectly fine. So to your question, I focus on every ending and it's an invitation to go forward into what's next. And someone said, you're a futurist. I said, yeah, if I can't see where I'm going, it's hard to live today, but I like to go. I don't know where I'm going, but let's go forward. Be a futurist.
Yeah. So would it be fair for me my take is what you just said is they're not endings, they're transitions?
Yes, sir. And the next is just as good. It can be just as good as the last. But
Sometimes
I'm much
better.
more concerned about the transitions than I ever used to be.
And I think that very well might be, Andy, the key to being open to change. The transitions can bring something new. It can bring something better rather than spending a lot of time mourning or assuming we're going to really miss what we have or where we've been.
Yep.
If we're able to look ahead and see opportunity and pursue opportunity, it kind of happens. So now I think it's a really good time to kind of go back up to the 30,000 foot level, if you will, or just look more at the big picture for a moment. So before we finish, I want to ask you the same question I ask every one of my guests, and that is, in the context of change, in the context of your work, in the context of life and your experience, what do you see as the point, and what would you like the listeners to walk away from this saying, when they say, what's the point, they'll have an answer? What do you see that to be?
That it's so good to really understand humans, the people who you are with, who you are working with, who you're doing things for. And I think that it's a great time that you can grow. The changes are all very exciting. Adopt them, embrace them, open your mind to them, test them, experiment, be curious. Don't think of them with fear, think of them with possibilities. And so if your listeners want one word of wisdom, the times they are indeed changing. I think Bob Dylan sang that in the 60s, but they are changing and they will keep changing, and let them change you as well. Open up. It's a great time to, even try on a new shirt with a new tie. No tie. I don't think anyone wears ties, but maybe I'll go back to it. But it's a time for change. So enjoy the journey and don't resist, embrace.
Outstanding. Thank you for your thoughtfulness and the insight that you've brought to this conversation, and the encouragement to change and some of the understanding of why we resisted, but more importantly, the benefit of embracing change. Listeners, I hope that this episode leaves you thinking about stories that you may be living inside of your head. I know I've got a few that I'm questioning now. I've got a question, is it a myth or is it real? And what can I do? Is there another way to see my story? Andy, thank you so very much. I appreciate your time.
Bill, you're a wonderful interviewer. I most appreciate being on What's the Point? And I'm going to think a lot about what is the point. Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening to What's the Point? If this conversation meant something to you, we hope you'll follow the show and share it with someone who might benefit from it. And if you know a guest with a story worth exploring, send me a message, bill@billellis.com. I'd love to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts on the show, and I'll see you next time.